Section 12. The Book of the Ancient Greeks. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Book of the Ancient Greeks by Dorothy Mills. The Great Persian Invasion under Xerxes. The Preparations. Chapter 9. The Great Persian Invasion under Xerxes. Part 1. The Preparations. The Persians. The Persians came again. When the report came to Darius of the battle which was fought at Marathon, the king, who even before this had been greatly exasperated with the Athenians on account of the attack made upon Sardis, then, far more than before, displayed indignation, and was still more determined to make a campaign against Hellas. He at once sent messengers to the various cities of the empire, and ordered that they should get ready their forces. Each city or community was called upon to send more men than at the former time, and to send also ships of war, and horses, provisions, and transport vessels. When those commands had been carried all round, all Asia was moved for 3 years, for all the best men were being enlisted for the expedition against Hellas, and were making preparations. But before the expedition was ready, a rebellion broke out in Egypt, and soon after Darius died, and, thus he did not succeed in taking vengeance upon the Athenians, Darius was succeeded by his son Xerxes. The first thing he did was to crush Egypt, and then he turned his attention to Greece. Mardonius, the general, who had been forced to retire from Thrace after the wreck of the fleet off Mount Athos, was anxious to persuade the king to undertake another invasion. He probably wanted to retrieve the reputation he had lost on the former occasion, and hoped that if Greece became a Persian province, he would be made governor. "Master," he would say to the king, "it is not fitting that the Athenians, after having done to the Persians very great evil, should not pay the penalty for what they have done." And he would add that Greece was, "a very fair land, and bore all kinds of trees that are cultivated for fruit, and that the king alone of all mortals was worthy to possess it." Xerxes did not need much persuasion. He came of a race of kings whose word was the law of the Medes and Persians that changeth not, and his wrath was great against the states that had not only refused to submit to the Persian king, but had actually defeated his army in battle. He would wreak his vengeance upon them for what they had done, and he declared that he would march an army through Europe against Greece, in order, as he said, "that I may take advantage on the Athenians for all the things which they have done both to the Persians and to my father. I will not cease until I have conquered Athens and burnt it with fire." Our knowledge of the preparations made for this invasion by Xerxes comes from Herodotus. He may have exaggerated some things in his account, but his history was written for the Greeks of his own time, and he wanted to make clear to them how great was the difference between the East and the West, how much better their freedom and independence were than the slavery endured by states which were ruled by the great king. For these states had no voice in the affairs of the empire. If the king went to war, they had to follow him and lay down their lives for causes in which they had no concern, and which generally only ministered to the greed and avarice of their rulers. Having decided on the invasion of Greece, Xerxes sent heralds throughout the empire, proclaiming the war and bidding all fighting men make ready and join the king at Sardis. There the troops were mustered, and in the spring of 480 B.C., 10 years after the Battle of Marathon, Xerxes and his army were ready to set out. They were to march to the Hellespont, and then, by way of Thrace and Macedonia, to descend into Greece. The fleet was to join the army at Hellespont, and by sailing close to the shore, to keep in constant touch with the army on land. At last all was ready, and the day came for the army to leave Sardis. First, the baggage-bearers led the way together with their horses, and after these, half the infantry of all the nations who followed the great king. Then a space was left, after which came the king himself. Before him went first 1,000 horsemen, chosen from amongst the noblest Persians, and then 1,000 spearmen. These were followed by 10 sacred horses with rich trappings, and behind the horses came the sacred chariot of the great Persian god, drawn by 8 horses, with the reins held by a charioteer on foot, for no human creature might mount upon the seat of that chariot. Then followed Xerxes himself, attended by spearmen chosen from the best and most noble of all the Persians. They were in turn followed by a body of men known as the Immortals, of which there were always 10,000. They bore this name because if any one of them made the number incomplete, either by death or illness, another man filled his place, and there were never either more or fewer than 10,000. These were the very flower of the Persian army. 9,000 of them carried spears ending with silver pomegranates, and the spears of the 1,000 who guarded the front and rear were ornamented with pomegranates of gold. Now of all the nations, the Persians showed the greatest splendor of ornament, and were themselves the best men, and they were conspicuous for the great quantity of gold they used. The Medes and Persians wore tunics and trousers, for which the Greeks always felt the greatest contempt, because they were worn by the barbarian and not the Greek, and soft felt caps on their heads. They carried wicker shields, and had short spears and daggers and bows and arrows. Besides these, a host of nations followed the great king. There were Assyrians, famous throughout all ancient history as a great fighting race, with bronze helmets, linen breastplates, and wooden clubs studded with iron. There were Bactrians, with bows of reed and short spears. Scythians, with their pointed sheepskin caps and their battle axes. There were Caspians, dressed in skins and wielding short swords. There were men of strange and savage appearance, some wearing dyed garments with high boots, others dressed in skins, and all bearing bows and arrows, daggers and short spears. Arabians came too, with their loose robes caught up, ready for action, and long bows in their hands. And dark Ethiopians, fearful to look upon in their garments made of the skins of the leopard and the lion. These fought with long bows, with sharp pointed arrows, and with spears and clubs. And when they went into battle, each man painted half his body white and half of it red. And other Ethiopians there were, who wore upon their heads horses' scalps with the ears and manes still attached. Many more nations and tribes were represented in this mighty army. Some carried small shields and small spears and daggers. Others wore bronze helmets, to which the ears and horns of an ox were attached. All these and many more made up the army of the great king. They came from north and south, from east and west, and from the islands of the sea. And they marched in magnificent array from Sardis to the shores of the Hellespont, where the fleet was to meet them. When Xerxes reached the strait, he had a throne of white marble built for him, and there he took his seat, and gazed upon his army and his ships. Now Xerxes had given orders that a bridge should be built across the Hellespont, over which the army should pass into Europe. But when the strait had been bridged over, a great storm arose which destroyed the bridge. When Xerxes heard of it, he was exceedingly enraged, and bade his soldiers scourge the Hellespont with 300 strokes of the lash, and he let down into the sea a pair of fetters. Whilst this was being done, the sea was thus addressed. Quote, "Thou bitter water, thy master lays on thee this penalty, because thou didst wrong him, though never having suffered any wrong from him. And Xerxes the king will pass over thee, whether thou be willing or no." End quote. The sea was punished in this way, and command was given to cut off the heads of those who had had charge of building the bridge. Not with impunity was the great king disobeyed. A new bridge was then built, stronger and more secure than the first, and over this the army passed in safety. In order that no accidents might happen, honor was paid to the gods, and incense and fragrant perfumes were burnt upon the bridge, and the road was strewn with branches of myrtle. The crossing was to take place early in the morning, and all were ready before the dawn broke. As the sun was rising, Xerxes poured a libation from a golden cup into the sea, and prayed to the sun that no accident might befall him till he had conquered Europe, even to its furthest limits. Having prayed, he cast the cup into the Hellespont, and with it a golden mixing bowl and a Persian sword, as gifts to the powers of the sea. When Xerxes had done this, the great army passed over the bridge in brilliant array. It took 7 days and 7 nights without any pause for the whole army to pass over, and it is said that at the end a man who dwelt on that coast and who had watched the crossing exclaimed, quote, "Why, O Zeus, in the likeness of a Persian man taking for thyself the name of Xerxes instead of Zeus, hast thou brought all the nations of men to subdue Hellas? Was it not possible for thee to do it without the help of these?" End quote. When the whole army had crossed over safely, Xerxes inspected it. He drove through all the ranks in his chariot, and scribes who accompanied him wrote down for him the names of all the nations who were represented. When he had done this, the ships were drawn down into the sea, and Xerxes, changing from his chariot to a ship of Sidon, sat down under a golden canopy and sailed along by the prows of the ships and inspected his fleet. The ships then set sail, and were to go along the coast to Therma, where the land army was to meet them again. Xerxes and the army then proceeded on their march through Thrace and Macedonia. Messengers had been sent on ahead some time before to make arrangements for provisioning this great host. All the towns through which the Persians passed were compelled to provide food and drink for the men and the animals with them. It was a tremendous undertaking, and scarcity and want were left behind as the invaders passed on. The inhabitants had to provide great quantities of wheat and barley. They were made to give up the best of the fatted cattle, their birds and fowls, and to provide everything in the way of gold and silver needed for the service of the table. All this was a great hardship to the people of the land, and in one place they went in a body to their temple and entreated the gods that for the future they would keep them from such evil. Nevertheless, they offered up a thanksgiving to the gods for all the mercies they had shown to them in the past, and especially for having granted that Xerxes, whilst in their city, had only thought good to take food once in each day, for it would have been altogether impossible for them to have provided him with breakfast in the same manner as dinner. The fleet sailed safely to Therma, and was joined there by the army as had been arranged. So far all had gone well for the Persians. They had succeeded in a great achievement, for apparently without any serious mishaps, this tremendous army had been transported from Sardis right round the Aegean, and had been fed and cared for on the way. The difficulties must have been very great, and only splendid organization could have done it successfully. But it had been done, and now Xerxes, in order to wreak his vengeance on one Greek city, stood with his army, composed of the fighting men of 46 nations, on the very threshold of Greece. From Therma he could look across to the mountains of Thessaly. He could see snow-topped Olympus, the home of the gods who watched over the fortunes of the freedom-loving Greeks. The Athenians had withstood the Persians at Marathon, but now the whole of the eastern world was marching against them. Could they withstand that mighty host, or would they be forced to submit? The Greeks. 10 years had passed between the Battle of Marathon and the arrival of Xerxes on the borders of Greece. In the years preceding 490 B.C., the Persian power had been a terror to the Greek. Not content with subduing Asia, even to the dim borders of India, the great kings had pushed their way to the Aegean, and had even conquered the Greeks who dwelt along its eastern coasts. Then, like an ominous war cloud, this mighty power had crossed the sea to Greece itself, but there the unexpected had happened. At Marathon, the Persians had sustained at the hands of a small state, till then comparatively unknown, the first great defeat they had ever met with. The Plataeans had helped, it is true, but their numbers had been small, and it was the Athenians who had really defeated the Persians. Since then, the Athenians had enjoyed a great reputation for their military power. Myths and legends had woven themselves round the name of Marathon, with the result that the power of the Athenians was reputed greater than perhaps it actually was, and that of Persia was certainly depreciated. If she had been as formidable as had always been supposed, how could the Athenians have defeated her almost unaided? So, for a number of years, the Greeks had felt less terror at the name of Persia, and they had been enjoying a certain feeling of security, little realizing how false it was. But suddenly they were shaken out of their calm. Rumors of the Persian preparations for an invasion of Greece reached them, rumors which were doubtless exaggerated, but which nevertheless had much truth in them. It is amazing how, in spite of slow and difficult communication, news was swiftly carried in those days from place to place. So the Greeks were fairly well informed as to what the Persians were doing. At this crisis the Athenians took the lead, and, quote, "If anyone should say that the Athenians proved to be the saviors of Hellas, he would not fail to hit the truth. These were they who, preferring that Hellas should continue to exist in freedom, roused up all of Hellas. Nor did fearful oracles which came from Delphi and cast them into dread induce them to leave Hellas." End quote. The first thing the Greeks did was to hold a conference at Corinth, which was attended by envoys from all the leading states except Argos and Thebes, which stood aloof. At this conference, the Greeks made 3 important decisions. They resolved that they would reconcile all their own differences and bring to an end the wars they had with one another. As Hellenes, they would unite against a common foe. Then they determined to send spies to Asia, who should bring back accurate reports of the preparations and power of Xerxes. And lastly, they would send messengers to the colonies in Sicily, Corcyra, and Crete, asking for assistance. 3 spies set out, but they were captured in Sardis and condemned to death. When Xerxes, however, heard what had happened, he sent for the spies, who were brought into his presence. To their surprise, instead of being led out to immediate execution, Xerxes commanded that they should be led round and shown the whole army, both foot and horse, and when they had seen everything, they were to be set free to return home. He did this because he said that, quote, "If the spies had been put to death, the Hellenes would not have been informed of his power, how far beyond any description it was, while on the other hand, by putting to death 3 men, they would not very greatly damage the enemy. But when these returned back to Hellas, he thought it likely that the Hellenes, hearing of his power, would deliver up their freedom to him themselves before the expedition took place, and thus there would be no need for them to have the labor of marching an army against them." Little did Xerxes know the kind of freedom-loving people with whom he had to deal. So the spies looked at everything and then returned to Greece. Meanwhile, the messengers to the colony returned. The answers to the appeal for support were very disappointing. Neither Sicily, Corcyra, nor Crete would help. They either refused outright or made uncertain answers. They seem to have thought more of their own preservation than of the safety of Greece as a whole. They thought the Persian would probably win, and they preferred either to be on the winning side or to be in such a position that they could make good terms with the Persian did he conquer. The Greeks now made ready to go out with their armies to meet the Persian foe. The chief command was given to Sparta, the greatest military state in Greece, and they marched to the Vale of Tempe in the north of Thessaly, where they hoped to meet Xerxes and prevent him from coming into Greece. When they got there, however, they found that it would not be possible to hold the pass against the enemy, for it was so situated that the Persians could attack them by sea as well as by land, and there was another path over the mountains by which the Persians could attack them in the rear. So the Greeks withdrew to Corinth in order to deliberate further where they would meet the enemy. This retreat from Thessaly took place while Xerxes and his army were crossing the Hellespont, and it had important consequences for the Persians, for the Thessalians, hitherto never very loyal to Greece, seeing the other Greeks leave their land, "took the side of the Medes with a good will and no longer half-heartedly, so that in the course of events they proved very serviceable to the king." The Greeks now decided on making a stand much further south, at Thermopylae. This was a narrow pass and easier to defend, so they resolved, "to guard it and not permit the barbarian to go by into Hellas." And they resolved that the fleet should sail to Artemisium, for these points are near to one another, so that each division of their forces could have information of what was happening to the other. At Thermopylae, the Greeks awaited the Persians. End of section 12.